Hey guys, so we're back tonight and we're going to read another fairy tale. We're going to read both a fairy tale and an adaptation of that. And tonight we're going to read Cinderella. So something you're probably all familiar with, but perhaps not familiar with the adaptation. So with that said, let's get started. And I will share my screen with you. We'll read the classic version first. Cinderella. Once upon a time, there was an honest man who took for his second wife the proudest and most unpleasant woman that had ever been seen. She had two daughters who had their mother's temper and resembled her in every other way. Her husband, on the other hand, had a young daughter who had a very sweet and gentle nature. She resembled her own dead mother, who had been the nicest person in the world. The wedding was no sooner over than the stepmother began to show the signs of her bad temper. She was jealous of the good qualities of her young stepdaughter, for they made her own daughter seem more hateful than ever. She gave the young girl all the most difficult tasks about the house. She had to wash the floors and staircases, clean the plates, and sweep out the rooms of the mistress of the house and her daughters. She slept on an old straw mattress in the attic at the top of the house, while her sisters had rooms with carpets and beds in the most fashionable style, and ornate mirrors in which they regularly admired themselves. The poor girl suffered all in silence, not daring to complain to her father. He would surely have scolded her because he was ruled by his new wife. When the girl had finished her daily work, she would sit amongst the cinders in the corner of the fireplace. Cinders are like ashes, that's how she gets her name. Because of this, she often looked dirty, and the younger of the two stepsisters, who was not quite as cruel as the other, called the girl Cinderella. But her shabby clothes did not prevent Cinderella from being 100 times more beautiful than her stepsisters, for all their fine clothing. It happened that the king's son was giving a great ball, and he invited all the young ladies in the kingdom to attend, so that he might choose one for his future bride. But he did not invite Cinderella because he had never seen or heard of her. When the two stepsisters received their invitations to the prince's ball, they were very proud and happy, and spent all their time deciding what clothes would be most flattering to them and how they should style their hair. And all this activity meant more trouble for Cinderella, for she had to iron their fine linens and press their ruffles and laces. The stepsisters could talk of nothing else but the ball. For my part, said the elder stepsister, I shall wear my dress of red velvet with the fine English lace. I have only my everyday silk petticoat, said the younger, but to make up for it, I shall wear my cloak with the golden flowers and my necklace of diamonds, which is quite fine. They called for Cinderella to ask for advice too, for she had very good taste. Cinderella gave them the best possible suggestions, and even offered to fix their hair, to which they gladly agreed. While she was combing their hair, they said, Cinderella, don't you wish you were going to the ball? But you fine young ladies are laughing at me. That would surely be no place for a plain girl like me. That is very true, the sister said. People would laugh to see a dirty cinder maiden in the ballroom. Anybody else but Cinderella would have messed their hair, but she was good-natured, and she fixed it even and smooth and made it as pretty as she could. The stepsisters were so excited that they broke more than a dozen laces by drawing them too tight to make their waists appear even more slender, and they constantly stood looking at themselves in front of the mirror. At last, the happy day arrived. Away the stepsisters went, and Cinderella watched them for as long a time as she could keep them in sight. When she could no longer see the coach, she began to cry. Immediately her godmother, who was a fairy, appeared beside her. She saw her tears and asked, Why are you crying, my dear girl? Oh, I should like, she was crying so bitterly that she could not finish the sentence. You would like to go to the ball, wouldn't you? Asked her fairy godmother. Yes, said Cinderella, sighing. Well, well, said her godmother. Promise to be a good girl, and I will arrange for you to go." Then she led Cinderella outside and said, "Go into the garden and bring me the largest pumpkin you can find." Cinderella went at once and picked the largest pumpkin that she could find, wondering how a pumpkin to her could ever get her to the ball. The godmother scooped it out, and when only the rind was left, she struck it with her wand. Instantly, the pumpkin changed into a beautiful coach, lined with rose-colored satin. Then she asked Cinderella to fetch the mouse trap from the pantry. Inside, there were 6 mice, all still alive. The fairy godmother opened the wire door, and, as each mouse came out, gave it a little tap with her wand and changed it into a fine horse, so that there were a team of 6 dappled mouse gray horses. "But what shall I do for your coachman, Cinderella?" she asked. "I will go and see if there's a rat in the rat trap," asked Cinderella. "We could make the coachman of him." "Quite right," said the godmother. "Go and see." Cinderella brought the rat trap, to which contained 3 large rats. The fairy godmother chose one with elegant whiskers. As soon as she touched him, he turned into a fat coachman with the finest mustache that was ever seen. "Now go into the garden, Cinderella, and bring me the 2 lizards that you will find behind the well." No sooner had she brought them than the fairy godmother turned them into footmen, who at once climbed up behind the coach in their braided uniforms, and hung there. I'm sorry, these words are really tiny. It's really hard for me to say. And hung on there as if they had never done anything else all their lives. "Well, Cinderella, now you are ready to go to the ball." "Oh," she replied, "but I am to go in these ragged clothes." The fairy godmother lightly touched Cinderella with her wand, and in an instant her ragged clothes were changed into garments of gold and silver cloth, sparkling with jewels. Then the godmother gave her a pair of glass slippers, the prettiest in all the world. Cinderella entered the splendid coach. Her godmother said, "Now, Cinderella, be on your way, but remember, if you stay 1 minute past midnight, your coach will again become a pumpkin, your horses mice, your footmen lizards, and you will look like the Cinder Maiden again in your old ragged clothes." Cinderella promised that she would not fail to leave the ball before midnight, and away she went, her heart filled with delight. As Cinderella's coach arrived at the palace, a buzz of excitement filled the air. Gracefully stepping from the carriage, she glided through the entryway and into the great hall. At once there fell a great silence. The dancers stopped, the violins played no more. So fixed was everyone's attention on the great beauty of the unknown guest. Everywhere could be heard in confused whispers, "Oh, how beautiful she is!" The king, old man though he was, could not take his eyes off her, and whispered to the queen that it was many a long day since he had seen anyone so beautiful and charming. All the ladies were eager to study her clothes and her hair, determined to copy her style the very next day, if they could find fabrics as fine and tailored as clever. The young prince placed Cinderella in the seat of honor, and then led her by the hand to dance with him. Such was the grace with which she danced that the admiration of all the guests grew even greater. A magnificent supper was served, but the young prince ate nothing, as he was so busy watching Cinderella. She went to sit beside her stepsisters and asked them to share with her the oranges and lemons that the king had given her, which greatly surprised and delighted them, for they did not recognize her at all. While they were talking, Cinderella heard the clock strike 1/4 to 12. At once she made a deep curtsy and said farewell and departed as quickly as she could. When Cinderella arrived home, she found her godmother waiting for her. Cinderella thanked her for all she had done and asked if she could attend the ball again the next day, as the king's son had invited her. While she was busy telling her godmother all that had happened, her 2 stepsisters knocked at her door. The fairy godmother vanished, and Cinderella let them in. "What a long time you have been away this evening," Cinderella said, rubbing her eyes and stretching, as if she had only just awakened. "If you had been at the ball," said one of the sisters, "you would not be feeling very weary at all. There arrived a most beautiful princess, the most beautiful that anyone had ever seen, and she was very polite to us both, and let us share her oranges and lemons." Cinderella was overjoyed. She asked them the name of the princess, but they replied that no one knew it, and that the king's son was so in love that he would give anything in the world to know who she was. Cinderella smiled and said she must have been beautiful indeed. "Oh, how lucky you are," she said. "Couldn't I see her too? Oh, please, Javette, lend me a yellow dress that you wear every day so that I may go to the ball." "Indeed," said the elder stepsister Javette. "This is a fine idea. Lend my dress to the dirty cinder maiden like you. You must think I'm crazy." Cinderella had expected the stepsisters to say this. She was not at all upset, for she was asking to wear the dress in jest and did not really want to wear it at all. The next night, the two stepsisters went again to the ball, and Cinderella, even more splendidly dressed than she was the first time, followed them a short time after. All night the king's son stayed close by her and paid her endless compliments. The young girl was enjoying herself so much that she completely forgot her fairy godmother's warning, and when the first stroke of midnight fell upon her ears, she thought it was not more than 11 o'clock. She rose and fled as nimbly as a fawn. The prince followed her, but could not catch her. As she ran, she lost her glass slippers, and the prince picked it up with tender care. When Cinderella arrived home, she was out of breath, without her coach or footman, and her old shabby dress. Nothing remained of her splendid clothes except the one little glass slipper, the mate to the one that she had lost. The prince asked the guards at the palace gate if they had seen the princess go out, but they had said they had seen no one except a young girl in ragged clothes, who looked more like a peasant than a young lady. When her two stepsisters returned from the ball, Cinderella asked them if they had enjoyed themselves, and if the beautiful lady had again been there. They told her that she had, but fled away at midnight in such haste that she had lost one of her little glass slippers. They told her that the king's son picked it up and did nothing but gaze at it for the rest of the ball, and that most certainly he was deeply in love with its beautiful owner. What the stepsisters said was true. A few days later, the prince announced, with the sound of trumpets, that he would take for his wife the maiden whose foot fit into the glass slipper. All the princesses and all the duchesses and the whole of the court tried on the slipper, but it fit no one. Finally, the king's men brought the glass slipper to the home of the two stepsisters, who each did all that they could to squeeze their foot into the tiny slipper, but they could not. Cinderella was looking on and saw right away this was her slipper. "May I please see if it will fit me?" she asked. Her sisters burst out laughing and began to make fun of her, but the king's servant looked closely at Cinderella. Seeing that she was very beautiful, he said that she should indeed try the glass slipper, as the prince had commanded that every maiden in the city try it on. The servant asked Cinderella to sit down. As soon as he put the slipper on her little foot, he saw that it slid on without trouble and was molded to her exact shape like wax. The two stepsisters were greatly surprised at this, and they were even more surprised when Cinderella drew from her pockets the matching glass slipper, which she also put on. At that very moment, her fairy godmother appeared. She gave a tap with her wand, and Cinderella's clothes changed them into a dress even more splendid than any of the others. The two stepsisters now recognized her as the beautiful person that they had seen at the ball, and they threw themselves at her feet, begging her for forgiveness for all the cruelty towards her. Cinderella raised them up and embraced them, saying that she forgave them with all her heart, and asked that they love her well from that day forward. Cinderella was taken to the palace of the young prince, dressed as she was in her fine new clothes. He found her more beautiful than ever, and a few days later they were married. Cinderella, who was as good as Cinderella, who was as good as she was beautiful, invited her stepsisters to live in the palace with her, and married them the very same day to two noble gentlemen of the court. So that's not the original, but that's sort of the classic version. The original one is, I think, as I told you yesterday, a lot more almost violent and graphic. It's really quite different than this, but this is probably the story that you guys are most familiar with. And then we're going to switch over and we're going to read Cinderella and the Vampire Prince, which is obviously based on the same kind of story, but very much different. And hopefully this will give you sort of some ideas about how creative you can get in writing an adaptation of a fairy tale. Cinderella and the Vampire Prince. It was dark and stormy night. At least that's how most scary stories start. And this is one of the scariest. Deep in the forest lived a girl named Ella. Each night she would rub cinders or ashes from her fireplace on her arms and legs to hide in the dark. Then she would sneak out for adventure. People began calling the girl Cinderella. They would spot her in the night, climbing trees, shouting at the moon, and playing with forest animals. During the day, Cinderella lived with her evil stepmother and two mean, overly clean stepsisters. Cinderella longed for the day that she could leave. She only felt happy when it was dark, but nobody understood her love of the night. One day, a golden envelope was slipped under her door. It contained an invitation to a ball at the nearby castle. The prince was looking for a princess. Cinderella had never wanted to marry a prince, but she so wanted to escape her mean stepmother and stepsisters. So she thought, maybe I should go. But there was a problem. Unlike her stepsister, Cinderella had nothing to wear to a prince's ball, and unlike her stepsister, she had no way to get there. Cinderella sat in a tree and felt sorry for herself. Just then, Cinderella's fairy godfather appeared. Her sweet and gentle fairy godmother was away on vacation. It had been a stressful year watching over Cinderella. Her fairy godfather was not so kind or trustworthy. "What will I wear?" asked Cinderella. Her fairy godfather waved his magic wand and laughed. Cinderella looked down. She was wearing a puffy dress with shiny red designs all over it. Her black sneakers stuck out from underneath. "And how will I get to the ball?" asked Cinderella. "Instead of a pumpkin, I will use this blood-red tomato," laughed her fairy godfather. "The prince will love it." The night of the ball arrived. Cinderella climbed out of her bedroom window and hopped into the tomato carriage. When she arrived at the prince's castle, everyone stared, especially the prince. "Who is this beautiful girl?" whispered the guests. Ghosts, mummies, zombies, ghouls, and all sorts of spooky creatures. What great costumes, thought Cinderella. But these weren't costumes. A band of witches began to play music. The prince strutted over to Cinderella and asked for the first dance. They twirled and spun and waltzed around the dance floor. "Thank you," said the prince. Then he danced with Cinderella's stepsisters and other girls. The hands of the clock raced around at dizzying speed until it was almost midnight. "It is time," announced the prince. "I must choose my princess." The prince carefully took one last sniff of each girl. The stepsister smelled like roses. The other girls smelled like cinnamon and apple pie. Then he sniffed Cinderella. "I pick you," he said. "My nose never lies. You will have the tastiest blood." Cinderella shrieked, "He's a vampire!" She bolted out of the castle as the clock stopped on midnight. One of her black sneakers fell off on the steep castle stairs. The prince grabbed her sneaker and chased after her. "That blood," he yelled. "That delicious, juicy blood. Please don't leave me. I will make you my princess of the night." Cinderella stopped in her tracks. Princess of the night? Just then, Cinderella realized that the vampire prince might not be so bad after all. So she married him. And the two ruled the night happily ever after. So that was a much different version of the same basic story. So that just gives you an example of how you can get really creative in your attempts at doing this. So what I want you to be working on is picking a story, a classic fairy tale, and finding a way to make it your own, finding a way to adapt it and change it to make it different, something you haven't heard before. Now, you could do something like change the time frame like we talked about before. You could make it a more modern story. You could change the characters like we just saw in that version of Cinderella where we have a vampire prince instead of a sort of true prince. You also notice that there are other changes in there, like there's a fairy godfather. I don't know how closely you looked at the pictures, but They weren't mice and lizards and things that were changed, but there were other animals instead. I saw a bear and a deer and rabbits and things like that. So you could change those. You could change the location of the settings. There's so many different types of changes you can make. What I want you to do is when you get started today on your writing, I want you to be really creative. I want you to think of ways that you can keep the same basic lessons of the story, and how can you do that, but also make it your own and change it a little bit. So if you have any questions, please let me know. Otherwise, I look forward to reading the first parts of your drafts. Remember, you don't have to write your whole draft today. I want you to write for 15 to 20 minutes, and then we'll pick up where you left off tomorrow and continue on as we work towards finishing one draft, and then we'll edit, revise, and work towards a final draft. All right, guys, I'm really looking forward to seeing what you can come up with.